Hello and welcome to part 2 of module 4 in our Angular series. Let's look at what we're going to cover in our session today. We're going to be talking about Angular pipes. Now one may ask, what are pipes? Pipes are simple functions. They are inbuilt and they allow us to change the way our text could look. So for example, we may want the item description in the user's card to display in uppercase, or we may want it to display in lowercase, and we can do that using the case pipe. We could also include a date in the user's card, and we could have that date in different formats. So we could have it in just numbers. We could have it as a combination of numbers and letters. So for example, the month could be spelled out in full or just 3 letters, right? And then the year and the day in numbers, things like that. We can do that with the date pipe. And then of course, we could also include currency symbols using the currency pipe. So let's now go and take a look at how we can include those pipes. So come to your project. In your Windows search bar, just type in VS Code, right? And if your project features in the recent folders and workspaces, you can click on that and that should open up Visual Studio Code along with your project. Alternatively, you can always use the node.js command prompt. Click open, right? And once you have the prompt, change directory to your project directory and then type in code space dot to bring up Visual Studio Code along with your project. So once your project is loaded, come straight to the cart component view file or the HTML file. And we'll start with the date pipe. We just put in some text here as on. And of course, the date is not something that we can, just type in. The date is going to change on a daily basis. So let's include a property, right? So come to your cart component TypeScript file and we can put in a property here. We can call it today's date of, or rather equal to, and we'll use the inbuilt date dot now. Okay. Right, so date dot now will put into the property today's date a huge number. We'll come to what that number means, right? Let's first go and compile this project. So to compile, you need to come to your Node.js command prompt and then type in ngserve. Press enter and the compilation should begin. For those who came through VS Code, now go to the Node.js command prompt. Right, and then of course once you open it, change directory to your project directory. Right, don't forget that, and then type in ngserve. Your compilation should begin as well. Once the compilation is done, we can load our browser now. Okay, so and we can see what that number looks like. Once the browser is loaded, type in localhost 4200, press enter. Right, so we should be seeing this huge number here, but we are not. And why is that? Any ideas? So come to your cart component view file and you can see here we haven't added the property to our document object model. How do we do that? Using Angular's property binding with interpolation. So double curly braces, today's date. Okay, so now if we go and look at that, we'll be able to see this huge number. That number represents the number of milliseconds that have elapsed from the date 1st Jan 1970. That's 1970. Now, obviously, nobody is going to make anything of this number, right? So we need to format that or transform this number into a date that is meaningful or into a date that is, understood by everyone. So come back to your card component view file and put in the pipe there now. You will get that by just pressing Shift and backslash on your keyboard together. Then you have the pipe symbol there and just type in the word date. Okay, so now if we go and look at that, remember we don't need to compile. So just come back to your screen and you can see now we have the date, or the number rather, transformed into a date that everybody can understand. Okay, now we could also take that further and transform the current date to a date that is fully in numbers, like a month, day, year format. Just put a colon there, open single quotes, and type in short date. Here it has to be exactly like this in camel case, right? Now, if we go and look at it, you can see that we have the month, day, year format. Okay, we could also transform this date into something else. So just change short to long. So now we have long date, and that will give us the month spelled out in full, right? And then of course the day and the year. Okay. There's another way we could display the date. Just type in there full date. So what do you think this will do? This will spell out the month in full, the day in full, the date as in 16 here, the number, and then the year. Okay, so these are some of the different ways you can display the date. So that's about the date pipe. Let's now look at the case pipe, right? We could use that, like I said, with our item description. So come to item description, shift and backslash to get the pipe, and just type in there uppercase. There's no quotes or anything required here. Just put in the word uppercase. And now if we go and add something to the cart, you can see the description appears in uppercase, right? You could change uppercase to lowercase. Just change the word upper to lower. Now if we go and look at that, if we add to cart, you can see the description appears in lowercase. So this is how we can transform our text, right? The last pipe we're looking at today is the currency pipe, and we can use that with total cost, shift and backslash to get the pipe. Just type in currency. Typing in the word currency will give us a US dollar. Now if we go and look at total cost, you can see we have the US dollar symbol there, right? Similarly, we could change that to or transform that US dollar to a euro. How? Just put in a colon, open single quotes, type in EUR. Okay, and now if we go and look at total cost, we'll have the euro symbol. And you could put in other currencies. So for example, GBP, British pound, and you will get the British pound symbol there. Similarly, you could have CAD, Canadian dollar, right? So as you can see, you can put in different currencies, right? INR as well, you will get the rupee symbol, and so on and so forth. Okay. So with the discussion of the currency symbol, we now have finished the first part of our session. The next part of our session will be focused on Angular services. Okay, now you may ask, what is a service? A service is a class, right? Remember, a class is what is defined in our TypeScript file. So the service is a class that will do a specific task, right? And then that service can be shared with the components that need that task to be performed. So instead of the components, uh, doing the task, we can take that task and assign it to a service and then share that service with all components, like I said, that need it. So that's what a service is. So the next question is, why would we need a service? So we've seen that the logic for our add quantity function is within the store component, right? Ideally, and this is recommended by Angular, the component should handle just the user interface part, uh, of that particular component, rather than focusing on both the user interface and the logic. The idea is to make the component leaner, right? So lesser amount of code means the component will be leaner, and that will lead to the component being more efficient. So what we are going to do is we're going to take the logic, that is the add quantity function, and move it to a service, and then share that service with the store component or any other component in our application that needs the logic. Okay, so that's what we are going to do in terms of including a service in our project. Now, how do we include a service? We first need to create the service. How do we create the service? We use the Angular command line interface. Remember, we used the Angular command line interface to create all our components as well as to add routing, right? Now we're going to use the Angular command line interface to create our service. And the command used to do that is ng generate service, and we do that once we get down to the code, right? So that's about creating the service. Once the service is created, Angular requires that the provider of the service be registered. Now, by default, Angular will register the provider for us at the root level. How? When we create the service, Angular puts in metadata into the service or the class file, right? Remember that when we created components, Angular put in metadata for each component as well. So similarly, when you create a service, Angular puts in metadata for the service, and part of that metadata includes the detail of the service provider. Okay, so we'll see that when we look into the service file we create. Once the service provider is registered, we can then make it available to the components that need that service by injecting the service into the components. Part of the metadata that Angular puts into the service includes an injectable decorator. And this injectable decorator will now indicate that Angular can use this class in its dependency injection system. Now, what is the dependency injection system? Components, when they are created, have a constructor, right? And you may have seen that. Now, again, components, when they're created or when they're instantiated, may have certain dependencies, and these dependencies could be a service like we're talking about now, or they could be a method or a function or a simple value as well, right? So any dependencies that the component needs in order to do its work need to be put into the constructor. And it is the constructor that Angular will look at when it's instantiating the component. Angular will check whether there's any dependencies that the component needs, and it will then provide those dependencies or make available those dependencies to the component. Of course, we need to specify in the constructor what those dependencies are, right? So developers need to put in that information into the constructor. And that's how the dependency injection system works. So let's take a look at a visual just to understand better. So here we have a service that's created. Angular has registered it at the root level. Now, if we look into the service file, we will see the injectable decorator. So once there is this injectable decorator put in by Angular, as I said, the service can now be injected into the components that need the service. And how do we do that? Through the constructor. So what we'll actually write within the constructor, or what code we'll put into the constructor, we will see when we get into the code itself. Right, for now, let's go ahead and create the service. So you need to come to your Node.js command prompt. I suggest you don't stop the server. Rather, you create a new instance, or you open up a new instance of the Node.js command prompt. How? Just type in Node.js command prompt. Click open and you will have another instance. Don't forget to change the directory to the project directory, right? Once you have that, and I already have one here, we can then proceed to generate the service. So ng generate service and the name of the service. Now you could call it logic handler, right? You could also call it order quantity tracker, right? Something that is meaningful to what our service will do, right? Remember, it's the add quantity function for now that's going in. But of course, don't name it add quantity because we already have a method by that name, right? Once the service is created, of course, you've got to press enter, right? After putting in the name, Angular will create the service for you. Once the service is created, then if you come to your project, you should see the service along with its testing file in the Explorer, right? So here's what I created, and you will see there's a testing file as well as a class or TypeScript file. If you click on that TypeScript file, you will see the metadata that Angular has put in. So you can see now the injectable decorator, as well as you can see that Angular has provided it at the root level. Okay. Now, as developers, we could choose to provide or to have the service provider at the component level, but then that service would be available to only that instance or that component and instances of it. Okay, so the recommended way to provide the service is at the root level so that it's available to all components in the application that need it. Right? Now below that we have export class and track odd quantity service. This is the name we will use when we inject the service into the components, and we'll see how to do that soon enough. Now that we have the service created, remember I said we're going to bring in the logic from the store component TypeScript file. So let's come now to the store component TypeScript file, and you can shrink the code, right? Then copy it, not really copy it. We don't really need this code now in the store component. So you can actually cut it, Control X, right? And then paste it in your service file. Control V will paste it there. You can see now we have a lot of squigglies here. Why? Remember, we got to also bring in the properties, right? So don't cut these properties or delete these properties from the TypeScript file or from the store component TypeScript file. Why? Remember, we've got total cost, items, cart quantity that are being shared from store to cart, right? So they need to be present here. So just Control C and then paste them into the service, right? Now you will see that most of the squigglies have gone away except for item array and item template. Now to take away the squiggly for item template, what do we need to do? We need to import item template, right? From, okay, now do I need a single dot or double dots? So the service, as you can see in the Explorer, is created in the app directory, right? The service is created in the app directory. Where is the interface? That's also in the app directory. So a single dot is what we need. Single dot / item interface. Again, why single dot? Because remember, both the interface and the service are in the current directory, and the single dot represents the current directory. Semicolon. Now what about item array? So our add quantity function is doing two things. It's getting the data from item array and then it's using that data. Now ideally it's recommended that these two be separate. Why? Imagine a real world environment where data is coming through a server, for example. We need to fetch the data from there. And we learn about that Angular command in a later session. But for now, of course, we're using item array, right, to simulate that environment. So we will have the function of getting data from item array in another service, and we'll make available that service to the track order quantity service. Now, how do we do that? We'll need to create another service first. So come back to your Node.js command prompt and type in again ng generate service, and you could name that store data, right, or get store data, right, something like that. I've just called it store item service. Okay, something that is meaningful again to what it is doing. Now press enter, of course, and then your service will be created. Once the service is created, you should see that service as well in your Explorer, right? Come to the TypeScript file or the class file, and you can see we have the metadata put in by Angular, right? This is the name we will use to make available or inject this service into the components that need it. What do we need to do in this particular service, or what is the code we need in the service? Remember, this service is now going to provide the data from item array to track odd quantity service, right? So we first of all need item array. So import item array, and again, which directory is item array in? Remember, item array is part of our global variables TypeScript file, right? That's where it's defined. And the global variables file is within the app directory, so also is the service. Therefore, we need a single dot, right, to represent the current directory, // global variables, semicolon. Now that we have the item array imported, we need to define a function here. So let's call it get store items. And this function is going to return the item array, which is of item template type, right? And all this function will do is it's going to return item array. That's all. Okay, now I have a squiggly under item template. Why? I need to import item template from, again, a single dot, right? Remember that item template is an item interface which is in the app directory, and our store item service is also in the app directory. So // item interface. Right, so now we have this particular service, that is a store item service, responsible for just that specific task. What is that task? To fetch the data, right, which in this case is coming from item array. Now we need to provide or make available this service to our track order quantity service, or whatever you've named the first service. To do that, we need to first import the service, right? That is the store item service, into the track odd quantity service. So import, and remember the name that we have to use is the name that is specified in the export class statement. So capital STOR, and then you should see that service in the list, right? And of course, Visual Studio Code does the rest. Of course, if it doesn't, remember it's in the current directory. So // and then you will see the name of the service. Just click on that. Once the service is imported, we also need to inject it into the constructor. Right, so now let's see how we do that. Come to the constructor. We need to specify a parameter here. So store item service, and that's going to be of type store item service. Here, as you can see, we're using the name from the export class statement. This is the name we give, right? So this is the parameter, and we will use this parameter in our code. Once we've injected the service into the constructor, we now need to capture the data that is being returned by the store item service, right? We have a statement saying return item array. So therefore, there's going to be data sent to the track order quantity service. How do we capture that? Let's have a property here, public products array of type item template, right? equal to the empty array. So now that's initialized. We can then use products array to call that function. So within add quantity, and let's put that in module 4, we say this dot products, this dot products array equal to, and now we will use the parameter we specified in our constructor. Okay, so this dot products array equal to this dot store. Now you see it doesn't appear here, right? Whereas it should appear, and the reason is we need to specify here the keyword private. Okay, if you don't do that, then we will also have a compilation error. So once we do that now, if we say this dot store, and you can see it appears there, store item service dot, right? Remember this function is defined in store item service, and we're using this dot syntax to get it. So, or to call it, dot get store items. So at the end of execution of this line of code, products array will contain the data returned by the method get store items or the function get store items, which is in the store item service class, right? Then of course we can use products array instead of item array. So we can say this dot products array, right, instead of item array, and then copy that down, Control C, and paste it over item array. Okay. Right, so what did we do? We created another service to fetch the data from item array. We have a function there which is going to return data which is of item template type from item array. And then within our track odd quantity service, we imported the store item service. We injected it as a dependency into the constructor, right? And then we use this parameter to call the function from the service, from the store item service, that is. We assign what is coming back or being returned by this function to products array, and that's how we capture that data. Once the data is captured, we can then use it in our function. Okay. So now that that is done, remember the store component now is dependent on which services? It's dependent on the track odd quantity service, but it is also dependent on the store item service. So what we need to do is we need to import both of the services. We don't need item array here. Now you can just delete that, Control and X, and instead we'll import both the services. So import store item service, right? And of course now there's a double dot, right? And you know why? Because now we are in the store component, and that directory is one deeper than the app directory. The app directory is one above, therefore 2 dots. And again we will import the track odd quantity service file, and again there's a double dot there, right? Once the services are imported, what do we need to do? We need to inject them as dependencies in the constructor. So again, put in there private right? Store item service, and that's going to be of store item service type. That's one dependency. And of course, there's one more, and that is the other service, which is track odd QTY service of track odd QTY service type, right? Now, once we've injected those dependencies, we are more or less set up. We don't need found and we don't need item object. They have been moved to the service file. So those we can delete. We do need these three, like I said, because they are shared with the cart component from the store component. So those cannot be deleted. Now let's go and see how this works, right? So we don't need to compile. You can see I have a message failed to compile. Now why? Maybe we have some errors. Okay, so here it says property add quantity does not exist on type store component. What does that mean? What this means is, remember I said that dependencies could include services. They also could include functions or a simple value. We have a method or a function in our track odd quantity service file, which is add quantity or add QTY. So we need to make it known in the store component constructor that there is one more dependency. We'll put here public add QTY. Okay, remember, why are we getting that error? Because in our store component HTML file, we are calling that function, right? We are calling add QTY, and add QTY is nowhere to be found in the store component TypeScript file. Therefore, we have that error. So once we provide the dependency, we shouldn't get that error. So here we will say this dot add QTY is the same as or is equal to track odd QTY service dot, and you see you'll get all the properties and the functions that are there. So we have add QTY. That's all. And now if we go and look at the code, or rather the project, right? Now let's see if this runs as we want it to. So add to cart. You can see we get our description, quantity, price. Add another. Again, we get description, quantity, price. Add a third. We get description, quantity, price. Our cart quantity is changing correctly. And so this works, right? So now we've included two services in our project, one to fetch the data and one to work on that data. As I said earlier, in a later session, we will tweak the code in the service that is fetching the data to use an Angular command that is, normally used in a real world environment to get data from an external source, right? So we'll do that in a later session. There's one more thing I need to tell you. So what if we wanted the data that is being supplied by the store item service to be sent not to another service, but to a component? So let's say, for example, we wanted the data to be sent directly to the store component, right? I'm just trying to give you another scenario. Now, how would we do that? So come to your store component TypeScript file. And here we would have to declare a function to get that data, right? So let's call it get items or get data from service. Okay. And here what we will do is we will call the function from the store item service. So this dot store item service dot get store items. But of course, we need to capture the data as we did in the service. So we would have to have a property here. Let's call it store array of item template type, right? And of course, initialize there as an empty array. And then we can put that property on the left of our call to the function. This dot store array equal to this dot store items service dot get store items, right? So at the end of execution of this statement, store array would now have the data returned by the service. Remember, we have already injected the service into the constructor of this component. Right, so we are now calling this function from the service, but where do we call this function from? It's not going to execute automatically. So one place we could call this function from is through the constructor, but that's not recommended. Why? Remember, the constructor is used to instantiate or create an instance of this component. And remember, in a real world environment, we're going to be fetching data from a remote server, for example. So it is not recommended that we have a call to a function that is fetching data from an external source within the constructor. We'd rather put it into the ng-on-init method, which is called just once after the component is instantiated, right? And Angular has checked the input properties. Right now, the ng-on-init method is directly connected to the on-init lifecycle hook, as it is called. Now, talking about life cycles, every component has a life cycle. It starts when the component is instantiated and ends when the component is destroyed. Now, there's many events that take place during that life cycle, right? And by implementing these life cycle hooks, for example, on init, we can, use those events to do certain things. And here we are going to be using the ng-on-init method to call the get data from service function, right? And like I said earlier, it's ideal because ng-on-init is executed just once. We want the data returned once to the component, and therefore this is the best place. So we put that call to the function here, this dot get data from service, and we can have a console.log statement, right, where we can specify store array, right, and have the data that is returned to store array displayed on the console, right? So now, once this is done, let's go back and look at our project. And of course, we have a console.log there. So right click inspect so that we have access to Chrome Developer Tools. Come straight to the console. And you can see there we have store array and the data returned. Okay, so this is the way you would send data from the service to the component. And this is the best method. Like I said, you could call the function from the constructor, but that's not recommended. So this actually finishes our session for today. In the next session, what we will be doing is, and let me show you. So let's say we add to cart, right? We add another item. Let's say we want one more of chocolate cake. You can see now the description appears twice the quantity appears twice and the price appears twice as well. Ideally, what should happen is that the description should appear once, the quantity should increase by one, the price should also appear once, right? So we will work on removing this duplicate displays in our cart. We will also provide additional functionality to the cart component where the user will be able to increase or decrease quantities of each item from within the cart itself, as well as remove items from the cart altogether. We'll also look at a scenario where the user's cart is empty, right? So all that in the next session. Till then, take care, stay safe, bye.